It's Sunday school, and it's also Rosh Hashanah. Tova Shana. So Happy New Year, everyone. Now, I'm not officially Jewish, okay? But I was going to say, according to an old commercial that nobody else remembers or is old enough to remember, I'm not a, I'm not Jewish, but I play one on TV. Actually, 22 years ago, I wrote a book called The Chicken Kabbalah of Rabbi Lamed Ben Clifford. Now, it was a tough sale to the publisher, who's Donald Weiser, who was himself, I guess we could argue that he was a real Jewish Kabbalist. But once he read the text, he got it and was happy to publish it. And but years and years later, in the very last couple of years of Pantheacon, when people were getting especially sensitive and conscious about people appropriating each other's cultures, so people that didn't read Chicken Kabbalah or know anything about it just looked at, oh, this is a guy named DuQuette calling himself a rabbi. I mean, they totally just didn't get it. I appreciate their sensitivity, but be that as it may, it was a gross mischaracterization of the work. Now, Rosh Hashanah is the first day of a 10-day period of reflection. Actually, the buzzwords are reflection, aspiration, and to pursue justice. And those are universal principles, and that everybody on the planet would be well served to engage in. So I'm happy to appropriate that into my personal philosophy. But at the end of the 10-day period, this is truly the Jewish New Year, so Happy New Year. And there's a 10-day period of this reflection and celebration, and there's traditions and foods and things like that to go with it. But it culminates on the 10th day with Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. And that's a pretty important day in traditional Judaism, and it sort of brings to an end that 10-day period of the High Holy Days. But according to tradition, something very dramatic would take place, a ritual, a ceremony, a magic ceremony would take place on Yom Kippur that had everything to do with this ineffable name of God. And under what circumstances was the high priest permitted one day a year, 10 days from now, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest of Israel was allowed to actually utter the name of Yod-He Vav-He. And I talk about that in a humorous way in the Chicken Kabbalah, and I've those of you who are familiar with the Chicken Kabbalah know exactly what I'm going to share with you in these just couple minutes today. But I'm going to read a little something else right at the very beginning of my introduction to the Chicken Kabbalah. For the last 20 years, well, that was 22 years ago, so for the last 42 years, I've attempted to introduce Kabbalah to students of tarot and ceremonial magic, in particular those who are interested in the work of the Golden Dawn and or Aleister Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis. The scope of this work is relatively narrow and deals primarily with the meanings and numerical equivalents of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the mysteries of the schematic diagrams known as the Tree of Life and the Cube of Space, and various exercises which the diligent student connects everything in the universe with everything else until there is no anything left. Now, about 10 years later, I wrote the accompanying book, which is called Son of Chicken Kabbalah, which actually lays out a program of a 3-degree program of self-initiation, sort of an expansion on the exercises and things that I cover in Chicken Kabbalah. But anyway, when I began to organize the material for this book, I realized that a vast majority of readers would not be familiar with my personality and the subtle nuances of my comedic timing, if you presume to call it that. I knew that if I were to plunge the unsuspecting reader directly into the waters of my Kabbalistic fairyland, the poor souls would immediately imagine themselves drowned in pure silliness. So I turned to a literary device that has a long and distinguished history in the world of Kabbalistic literature: pseudepigraphy, or the ascription of false names of authors to certain works. Revered Hebrew scholar Gershom Scholem wrote, quote, "For a long time, we've known that literary forgeries represents a flight into anonymity and pseudonymity just as often as they indicate trickery. And not for nothing have we retained the foreign word pseudepigrapha, to designate in particular a legitimate category of religious literature, a legitimate category of religious literature." I repeated that myself. The Zohar is the most important, but not far the only example of such love of masquerade in Jewish literature. So I decided to do what Rabbi Moshe de Leon did when he wrote the Zohar in the 13th century. He credited authorship to a fictitious holy man, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, a 2nd century victim of the Roman persecution, who, while hiding for 13 years in a cave, was inspired by God to write the Zohar. Okay, I'm going to skip over things. For my purposes, I invented Rabbi Lamed ben Clifford, legendary l'enfant terrible of the modern Kabbalistic movement. Ben Clifford afforded me the opportunity to soar to outrageous and hopefully memorable heights, and when necessary, stand apart from the silliness to highlight the golden eggs of Kabbalistic wisdom nested therein. This may smack a bit of schizophrenia, and I must admit I've enjoyed being the rabbi's biographer and critic. I hope the reader will also be able to suspend his or her belief long enough to join in the fun and learn the fundamentals of Kabbalah. Now, I might add that even in the outrageous silliness of the format of my text and the fanciful backstories that I use to introduce these pretty sometimes dry and complex Kabbalistic principles, there is still in-jokes within in-jokes within in-jokes that upon repeated readings peel back certain layers of what I consider significant Kabbalistic truths. But anyway, that being said, and because it's Sunday and we need a little bit of interpretation, what I'm trying to get at, I want to talk about the word that cannot be spoken and leave you with one little anecdotal thing that I'm sure most of you who are familiar with this are either looking forward to me doing it or saying, oh God, he's going to do it again. But it has everything to do with 10 days from now. Okay. Tradition informs us that each year on the 10th day of Tishri, okay, this is the first day of Tishri, the Day of Atonement, the high priest of Israel made 3 trips into the most holy place of the great temple and sprinkled the Ark of the Covenant with blood. Now, I've gone to great lengths early on in the pages before this to talk about the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, let's see. And that the Ark of the Covenant was, in essence, a very elaborate but primitive electrical device. Similar on a larger scale to primitive batteries that were found in Egyptian tombs, containing plates lined with salt holding water, shishim wood, alternating plates with plates of pure gold, pans of liquid with rods for an anode for the 2 poles, the 2 angels sitting on the top of the lid with their wings almost touching tip to tip, with a spark going in between the 2 tips. The technology was there at that time, if indeed that time was that time. But that's a whole nother story. In other words, and they had to carry the ark around. The men that carried it couldn't touch it, otherwise lightning would strike them and they'd die. That's how it's described in Scripture. So they had to wear special shoes, and they could only carry the ark because the ark had rings along the side, and they would shove like insulated poles through the rings, and then they would just hold the poles. And they described once when one of the carriers tripped, the others put their hands up to steady the ark as they were carrying it down the road, and they were struck by lightning and fried to death. The ark was a dangerous tool, and it seemed like the Temple of Solomon or first of all, the tabernacle in the wilderness and the Temple of Solomon were built as a proper containment chamber for this almost futuristic technological light show. So I go to great lengths to explain that. Okay, all right. Let's see. Boy, that was a digression. The high priest of Israel made 3 trips into the most holy place of the great temple and sprinkled the Ark of the Covenant with blood. Around his leg was tied a long braided rope, and the other end of the rope was held by friends of the high priest who were stationed well outside the veiled confines of the most holy place. The most holy place was like a room inside a room inside a room. Okay. And the Ark of the Covenant was there, and he could only walk in there on this 10th day of Tishri. Okay. On his 3rd visit to the most holy place, while a multitude of the faithful stood outside the temple and made a lot of noise, sort of like the organist at a baseball game trying to whip up the crowd to make a lot of noise. So, deet, 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 deet. Okay. Well, while the faithful outside the temple made a lot of noise, the priest placed his hands directly upon the ark and uttered the ineffable name as the fiery deity revealed itself in cloud and lightning. That's how it's described in Scripture. In cloud and lightning above the lid or the mercy seat of the ark. Sounds like a simple ritual, doesn't it? It was not unlike those practiced by Egypt and Babylonian priests who once or twice a year penetrated their gods, sanctum sanctorum, and offered prayers and oblations before sacred statues or other holy objects. What made this ceremony a little different, however, had to do with that rope the high priest had tied around his leg. It was put there for a pretty good reason. A reason that, while perhaps not immediately apparent, had everything to do with the correct pronunciation of Yod He Vav He. The rope was needed because every once in a while, at the climax of this supreme ceremony, the high priest exploded. Not only that, after the poor fellow's spectacular departure, the Holy of Holies filled with so much smoke and fire that it became too dangerous to enter, and the barbecued remains of the priest had to be dragged from the chamber by a rope. The next year, a new high priest would have to give it another try. In order for us to understand these strange circumstances and the true pronunciation of the ineffable name, it'll be necessary to talk briefly about the Ark of the Covenant. And here I give the instructions taken straight from Scripture. And so I'm not going to repeat that. The Ark was a lethal weapon, and the Israelites treated it like one. They kept it wrapped in cloth and leather, and the men who carried it had to wear special clothes and special shoes. That didn't always help. The Bible tells us that people who accidentally touched or got too near the ark were struck by lightning or consumed by flashes of fire. Like Lon said, the Temple of Solomon appears to have been built not so much as a house of worship, but as a prison for the dangerous and unpredictable ark. The Holy of Holies, where the ark rested, was built like a containment chamber, a perfect cube, 30 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 30 feet high. The floor, walls, and ceilings were lined with pure gold, weighing an estimated 45,000 pounds and riveted in place with golden nails. Now, this is described in Scripture. Sometimes the ark would belch out so much smoke that the priests of the temple were driven out completely out of the building and could not perform their routine duties. Now, you could imagine that happened occasionally on its own, kind of spontaneously, when either a barometric pressure or humidity or static electricity in the air under certain conditions just spontaneously kicked off a reaction like that. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that a wooden box with double lining of gold enclosed with a slab of gold containing pots of mysterious substances, heavy plates, and rods submerged in a pan of liquid was in all likelihood a giant and unstable battery or capacitor. 2 cherubim on the lid served as the anode and cathode, and the sparks are called arcs. The flaming presence of God jumped madly between the tips of the 2 highly conductive golden wings. Then I remind you that batteries were found that were many years older than the supposed date of the King Solomon's temple. Okay, the high priest must have been a pretty brave fellow to enter the room and play electrical Russian roulette with old Sparky. As he lay both hands upon that terrible device, his flesh would divert the current that normally arced between the cherubic wings, and for one spectacular moment, the power of Yod-He-Vav-He literally dwelt in his contorting body. He was tased. If he survived the event, he was most likely transformed into a very mellow, holy man, exhibiting the same docile behavior and mystical inscrutability of patients of modern shock therapy. I'd guess he's probably pretty interesting to talk to, too, full of spiritual insights and profound messages from God. So, dear ones, that's the secret of the Ark of the Covenant. But I hear you asking about the true pronunciation of Yod-He-Vav-He, the ineffable name of God. Well, I think every year is pronounced a little differently. But if I were to give you a general idea of how it sounded, I would say it sounded something like, and because I had to write it down, it sounded something like that. Okay. So much for my Rosh Hashanah message for today. I'm even wearing my faux rabbinical hat. Okay, and Constance, of course, makes me wear a tie for Sunday school. So until tomorrow, continue to be good to yourself, be good to each other. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will.